The early morning clouds and fogs covered the area around Farmhold for miles, perfectly concealing my transport's departure and climb into the sky. The windows began to be covered in ice as we reached the edges of the planet's atmosphere, and I again checked all the seals, not wanting to experience any form of decompression on my first journey off-world, even if it was just into low orbit to attend a meeting on board an awaiting ship. My transport was thankfully designed for such trips, and could, according to its included manual, even make the trip to a planet's moon safely. However, stories of bodies freezing or otherwise greatly suffering, overheard during our pilgrimage to Solaris as a child, had left quite the impact on me, it seems. As the transport broke free of the clouds and I saw my destination, a large cruiser that looked as if it were some sort of bulk civilian transport. After contacting the cruiser, identifying itself as the independent Newarthian vessel Haven, and after confirming the course and other such necessities of the docking procedure, I set the transport's controls and waited as my ship closed the distance to the landing bay, entered, and set itself down in the assigned landing area. Hearing the massive doors close and the bay fill with atmosphere, I looked out at the sleek, curved designs of the Teltechian ship, and was only pulled away from the various ongoing details, such as the psi forms that were working in the bay, by the console beeping to indicate the process was complete and I was safe to disembark, with a glowing button to activate the departure ramp and doors. I pressed it and made my way off the transport, meeting a Teltechian man as soon as I was on the base deck. He was a small man, and even without the lab coat it was obvious he was a man of science. "Greetings, Lord Katheon. Please, this way." He motioned and led the way to the meeting hall, making small talk along the way. His name was Katheon, an inventor of some fashion, and he was most happy to talk about the goings-on of the recent years in the interstellar arena. It was not particularly an interest of mine, for my own concerns were far more local at this point, and the fact that this meeting was in regards to a group of settlers that had come to ask permission to join Farmhold was the only reason I had left the affairs of home at all. However, the passion he was relaying the information with was more than enough to spark my own interest, for the duration of our walk at least. The meeting itself took several hours, as the representatives of the groups making up the potential settlers had nearly as many questions for me as I for them. Commitments and loyalty, laws and their enforcement, all were gone over either in brief or in great detail, as was needed. By the meeting's end, it was understood that pending full approval by the rest of Farmhold, they'd be able to begin the process of conveying their people and the rather large amount of materials and personal property to Farmhold, as it was unlikely that they were not going to be welcomed by all. That evening, I relayed the details, my impressions, and reasoning for allowing the settlers to begin to everyone, while we looked over the city's plans and began arranging where everyone would have their lots, either above ground for the Ortkin, the few Teltechians and elves, or below ground for the Rodkin and dwarves that made up the settlers. Almost a total of 5,000 would be making their home within our walls, with a near plurality of those of a militaristic bent and those of a more logistic or civic persuasion, with many, if not most, coming from houses or clans that were noted for their crafting or artistry, bringing many technical and productive skill sets to our growing community. The captain of the ship that they were on had expressed his willingness to allow for a long period for his passengers to make their way down to Farmhold, as all involved wished to undertake this with as little notice or fanfare as possible. It would take months, but by doing it this way, each family and person would be able to move not into a temporary shelter to wait for their home's construction or excavation, but move directly into a ready and freshly built home. It also allowed for a more gradual and therefore more effective integration with the existing residents of Farmhold, helping to prevent any issues by catching them early and addressing them head on. At the end of everything, I had broached the one question that no one had asked during the entire discussion. Why were they coming here, and what were they running from? A collection of personages and skills that was represented here would be a welcome boon to any colonial effort. So why seek to settle on the home realm, if not to benefit from the protection that mere presence here affords? To their credit, none looked surprised at all when I began to lay out why exactly they had left Newarth, hungry for a place with both the challenges that the Wild Realms would offer, and desiring for their families and loved ones to have the peace of mind of living in the safety of the home realm. It was simple. The Teltechian elements of the group, while very few in number, were something that the Teltechians as a whole denied the existence of publicly. They are known as the Slaudiitch, and thus were in a odd gray area of being considered too dangerous not to be under total confinement, while there existed means and ways to allow them to mitigate much of the danger. Unfortunately, it seems there are those in the Teltechian power structures that would see the Slaudiitch as an embarrassment to be locked away, if not a mutation to be purged. DM, the leader of the Slaudiitch that this group of settlers chose to leave their clans and homes to protect and support, informed me that all the needed systems and precautions were at hand, not only for his brothers and sisters that were with him now, but for their full number. Most of his people were still back in Physiolock, hidden away from those that would see them killed in their sleep, or forever imprisoned for the crime of being a blemish on the Teltechian race. He told me that his men would serve, and they would never bring harm to Farmhold or her people, so long as everyone involved were reasonable in how things were conducted. It was then that Lassen raised his hand and asked a question that, by the nodding of everyone else, had been common among my growing family of Farmhold. One I should have seen coming, to be fair. What in the guns is a Slaudiitch? By the 9 and 4, welcome back to the library. I am the recorder, and in this entry we will be covering in brief one of the unforeseen and more tragic consequences of the Teltechians' flight from their home galaxy to that of the realms. That being the Slaudiitch. Teltechians that suffer from an abnormality that drives them to rage and destructive ends if not properly managed. As always, my perceptive patrons, this will be just a brief look into these victims of the reality that they are born into. First, it is important to note, for a fuller understanding of why the Slaudiitch are how they are, that the Teltechians, while being very similar to normal, flame-forged humans, stretch that similarity quite mightily. They have entire systems of organs that are not present in the rest of normal humanity. These function to control and manage the various gifts and powers that the Teltechians have, and were engineered over thousands, if not more, years. This series of overlapping systems was designed to manage any possible variation in environment or setting, to allow the Teltechians to adapt and function anywhere they may find themselves. The Slaudiitch are those that have expressed a trait that is beyond these systems' ability to adapt to or otherwise adjust to. that trait being magical ability. For some unknown reason, magical abilities that are so common within the realms were not part of the Teltechians' own understanding of reality, or in fact may not to even have existed in the manner that we understand. This incompatibility causes the mind of the typical Slaudiitch to descend into a rage and madness, seeking to destroy any that are not similarly affected. The addition of magic to the already scary range of an ability that a Teltechian can possess made the Slaudiitch a major concern when they began to appear in the population in the early years after their arrival in our galaxy. Fortunately, both the Analar and the dragons of the Expedus fleet were more than willing to lend their aid in this matter, working with the Teltechians on creating some means of reining in the Slaudiitch. This took the form of the Dichan armor that they are encased in once it is discovered that one is carrying the madness of the Slaudiitch. The armor contains their abilities, as well as focus the still-aware mind of the Slaudiitch. Unfortunately, this focus can only be directed and maintained by one of the very rare number of the Slaudiitch that has managed to overcome the madness and retain or regain general control over their minds. These leaders are limited in the numbers of others they can guide without themselves being pulled back into madness by their charges, with some able to command no more than a few, and others able to command entire formations of their fellows. However, due in part to the lack of enough leaders to manage the numbers of Slaudiitch, and partially due to the great fear of what the presence of such forces of destruction would have on their reputation in their new home, it was decided that all Slaudiitch would be kept in stasis, locked away from being able to cause harm to others or disgrace the Teltechians as a whole. The problem with this course of action was that the onset of the slide into becoming Slaudiitch only started in the Teltechians' mid to late 20s, as the last of their Teltechian organs and systems fully established themselves. Further, it also required the awakening of their magical abilities, and this could occur at any time afterwards or even before. This means it could not be kept completely under wraps, and the fact that the designs for the Dichan armor had been passed out far and wide in those early days as a means to contain the issue when it first arose, there were plenty of people within the Teltechian populace that saw harboring and protecting these victims of fate from what they saw as unfair imprisonment as the noble and proper course of action. Before this could become a larger issue, however, the events of Vanson's summoning took place, and soon after, the Antani made their presence known. The series of battles and conflicts that followed the Teltechians pushed them back into a very primitive tech base, lacking several materials required for their abilities to manifest or be usable. While this also made the Antani unable to track them down, the more important point for our purposes is that without the full awakening of their Teltechian abilities, the curse of Slaudiitch faded from memory after only a few hundred years. Those that had been set into stasis before the coming of the Antani would see the next several thousand years pass with no change. With the Age of Stars and the reunification with the home realm, and more importantly, the return of their people to their proper forms and abilities, the curse of the Slaudiitch returned. But the government of the Teltechians was ready this time. The policy of stasis was maintained, but with the exception for those rare leaders and those who followed them, and even this was seen as a dangerous allowance, but was made at the insistence of several unknown but presumed divine personages. The one law that these wandering Slaudiitch must obey is that they may not be allowed to ever be active and lacking a leader, as that would result in the group falling on any and everything around them in an aimless, destructive rage. To ensure this, each Teltechian armor has a self-destruct that will activate if the presence of a leader cannot be felt for more than a few minutes, with the obvious exception of them being in a physiolock. Physiolock is a form of stasis that the Slaudiitch will enter to when not actively in combat or otherwise performing duties that allow their rage to be guided beneficially. In this special stasis, they are able to shift their minds from their bodies to a shared space with their fellows. This space is the only place that they can act and interact with each other free from that all-consuming rage, as the biological components of the rage, generated by the incompatibility with their biological systems, is not present. Developed as a long-term storage solution and safeguard, and as a way for the afflicted to have some sort of life beyond sleep and destruction. The existence of the physiolock stasis system is among the greatest tools that can be used in maintaining a force of Slaudiitch. Slaudiitch are terrifying on the battlefield, as their Teltechian armor allows them to channel their powers and abilities in frightening and uniform ways. Supernatural speed, strength, dexterity, and reflexes are but the minor effects, even as potent as they are. Their ability to conjure nearly any kind of weapon from thin air, from blades and other close combat weapons, to Teltechian anti-armor assault weaponry, and more commonly, advanced Christ weaponry, allows them to prove effective in nearly any situation. Under the direction of a leader, they can be used in surprisingly complex tactics and battlefield maneuvers. As well filled with rage, the focus of their leader and his designs for the battle are shared with his men, making the tactics and moves seem intuitive and natural, unless something in the field would contradict that, in which case the Slaudiitch will adapt as needed. Remember, under all that anger and confusion is a mind, and still able to think and decide how best to follow orders, especially when the guidance of their leader is there like a lighthouse in the fog for them to follow. Even with the policy of allowing leaders and their group to exist outside a stasis lock, it is less a policy of release, and more one of not attempting to recapture them if they are able to extract themselves completely from the Teltechian security forces in place to watch over them. This is thought to allow only the most focused and able of leaders and groups to be at large, while keeping the light of hope for others, driving them to better control their own selves in the aim to likewise find a way to rejoin the greater realms, even in such a limited fashion, as elite warriors capable of fighting many times their number and of apparently much greater strength. I hope you have a better understanding now, my perceptive patrons, of the Slaudiitch and the place they are trying to find within the realms, as they do what they can to manage their afflictions safely, while still being a part of their adopted home as much as they are able to. Until you next find your way back to the library for another entry, I have been, as always, the Recorder, and I thank you for your time and your interest. Thank you. Now, by the 9 and 4, be well, take care of yourselves and each other.